Gaudeamus omnes in Domino, diem festum celebrantes, sub honore sanctorum omnium.
Welcome to The Way of the Fathers. I'm Jim Papandrea. This podcast is a production of Catholic Culture. Sign up for our newsletter at catholicculture.org/newsletter. Today we continue our series on the Doctors of the Church with our second episode on St. Bernard of Clairvaux. St. Bernard is the one who coined the phrase, "The road to hell is paved with good intentions." Now, why would he say that? Well, stay tuned, as we used to say in radio, and I'll tell you. St. Bernard was a prolific writer, but we don't have any original documents. You see, they were still using wax tablets in his day, and that's all he ever used. He expected that what he wrote on wax would be copied by a secretary, if at all, or he dictated to an assistant. But we don't have anything in his own hand. And what this means in a practical sense is that often the same document can have several different titles, depending on who translates it. Of the documents that were dictated or copied, around 500 letters have survived, and one biography, The Life of St. Malachy. He also preached hundreds of sermons, but he didn't write them down at all. So what we have comes from the notes his students took. And we do have 86 sermons on the Song of Songs. But these are less an interpretation of the text and more his own musings, using the scripture as a kind of springboard for writing down his own thoughts. What interpretation there is follows in a long tradition of an allegorical interpretation of the Song of Songs, in which the concept of the wedding is an allegory for the church's anticipation of the heavenly wedding banquet. And the bride is an allegory not only of the church as the bride of Christ, but also of the individual soul as anticipating marriage to the bridegroom. By the time St. Bernard was 35, he had written some of his most important material. He wrote The Steps of Humility and Pride, picking up where St. Benedict had left off, and In Praise of the Virgin Mother, and On Loving God. But St. Bernard was often called away from his desk and his monastery to be the arbiter in controversies in France and across Europe. He mediated a controversy with the monastery of Cluny, where Peter the Venerable was abbot. The issue seems to have been whether or to what extent a particular monastery should conform in every way with other monasteries. Bernard wrote a document called Apology to William of St. Thierry, in which he criticized both sides in the dispute and clarified the balance of a toleration for some diversity within the unity of the Church. And as a result, Cluny did institute some reforms. In 1128, at the Council of Troyes, he was instrumental in getting approval for the Knights Templar, which had been founded by his cousin, Hugh of Payne. He wrote the Book in Praise of the New Militia, and here he criticizes secular knighthood, which he had left behind to become a monk, but he said that monasteries are fortresses and monks are soldiers, soldiers for peace. And he further clarified the Church's definition of just war, saying that the justice, or not, of a war depends on the motives for it, though he would later have to nuance that even more, as we'll see. In the 1130s, he was involved in a controversy over the papacy of Innocent II, and he rebuked the antipope who opposed him. And St. Bernard actually had to travel around Europe with Pope Innocent off and on for over 7 years to establish Innocent's legitimacy. And the point to note is that the people took St. Bernard's word for who the legitimate pope was. And because of him, all the royalty of Europe supported Innocent as pope, and Jerusalem acknowledged the pope as well. Bernard also rebuked the King of France and another pope, Eugene III. He got the Count of Champagne to advocate for the poor, and got the notorious Duke of Aquitaine to repent and be reconciled to the Church. Once, when the people of the town of Metz were rebelling against their nobles, he got out of his sickbed to travel there, and at first the nobles refused to meet with him, but when they saw him heal someone, he was able to negotiate peace. At the request of the Archbishop of Sens, he wrote On the Conduct and Duties of Bishops, and he would later write On the Precepts and its Application, an interpretation of debated points in the Rule of St. Benedict, as well as an ongoing series of letters to Pope Eugene III, which is called On Consideration. And this is part critique of the Roman Curia, part treatise on contemplation. Now here, consideration means discernment, and he gets that term from Gregory the Great's pastoral rule. Bernard's advice to Pope Eugene III is to have a better balance of the administrative side of his office and his spiritual life. It seems the Pope was spending too much time on worldly matters, including judging disputes between nobles, and apparently not spending enough time in prayer. So, St. Bernard attempted to teach the Pope how to be a contemplative. And in this, he's writing as though he is the Pope's abbot. And it's this ability to sort out controversies, negotiate peace, and even school the popes that earns St. Bernard the title Arbiter of Christendom. But his most famous controversy was with a professor named Peter Abelard. Abelard has rightly been called a heretic, though his heresies were subtle, and it's not always clear whether he actually believed some of the things he said. Abelard was a man who, rather like Origen, was a bit too smart for his own good, and his faith was actually so strong that he believed nothing could shake it, not even questioning it. And so he liked to play devil's advocate, putting questions to his students that, in his refusal to give them straight answers, left the students confused. For one thing, he argued that if grace is a free gift, no one should have to pay for it, not even Christ. And anyway, he said, God forgave sins before Christ ever came along. And so he rejected Anselm's satisfaction theory of atonement. Abelard seemed to lean into an almost Arian view of salvation, that Jesus didn't really have to die to make salvation possible, and that what really matters is whether we follow his example. And yet, when you read his personal letters to his wife Heloise, he sounds quite orthodox. Abelard liked to say that what matters is a person's intentions, even more than actions. And to be fair, he begins from some things Jesus himself said. But Abelard went too far when he said that the Sanhedrin who crucified Jesus did not sin because they thought they were doing God's will. Well, this got him in trouble. William of St. Thierry wrote to St. Bernard to alert him about Abelard's teaching. Bernard tried to confront Abelard privately, but Abelard proved unteachable. And so St. Bernard wrote, Against the Errors of Abelard. Now, in his book in praise of the new militia, Bernard had defended the idea of just war by saying that what mattered most was a man's intentions, his reasons for fighting. But that second crusade, the one Bernard himself had gone on a preaching tour to recruit crusaders, well, the Christians lost that one, and St. Bernard took the brunt of the criticism. He apologized to the Pope, but explained why they lost. It was the immoral but unsanctioned actions of the armies that caused God to refuse to fight for what should have been the good guys. The failure was due to a lack of humility on the part of the Christians. They got greedy. Well, in fact, they got all the deadly sins. St. Bernard wrote in another context, Consider carefully that it is not those who cry out for peace, but those who make peace that are commended. But at the end of the day, this same kind of criteria of intention was being used by Peter Abelard to teach confusion, if not heresy. And so St. Bernard saw the danger inherent in this intentionalism, specifically that it can lead to relativism. And so, in Against the Errors of Abelard, he wrote his response to Peter Abelard's intentionalism. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, or something to that effect in Latin. The controversy came to a peak at the Council of Sens in the year 1140. Abelard had challenged St. Bernard to a debate, but Abelard was an experienced debater, and the audience included the King of France, many cardinals and bishops, as well as a lot of lay people who were there for the spectacle. St. Bernard was reluctant to debate and felt his opponent had a kind of home field advantage. So he simply began with a series of readings from Peter Abelard's own writings, specific passages that were seen as problematic. But instead of defending his writings, Abelard could not argue his case. He would later say that his memory and presence of mind failed him, and this experienced debater couldn't find the words to say in his own defense. All he could do was ask for a change of venue, Rome, and Abelard would be declared a heretic. And he would eventually retract his heretical writings and apologize, and he and St. Bernard were reconciled. The same year as the council, St. Bernard preached to students in Paris. In fact, the famous Peter Lombard was in the audience. And in his sermon, called On Conversion, he praised the monastic life and invited his audience to join him at Clairvaux, and over 20 of them did, including some of Abelard's students. So what of St. Bernard's mysticism, and what makes St. Bernard a mystic? Believe it or not, he's one of the pioneers of clarifying the distinction between meditation and contemplation. Meditation is to reflect on some created thing, or to reflect in order to know about something. But the goal of prayer is not simply to know about God, but to know God. Contemplation, then, leads to experiential knowledge. Or, to put it another way, meditation leads to knowledge, contemplation leads to wisdom. Contemplation, then, is not simply a devotional practice, but a way of life. It's a journey or a path that leads into deeper knowledge of God. For Bernard, there are 4 steps or stages on this path, or as he put it, 4 levels of deepening love for God. Now, in this, he's building on the work of prior mystics like St. John Climacus and St. Maximus the Confessor. The first step is humility. The second step is compassion. The third step is contemplation. And the fourth step is one most people will never experience. It's that mystical union with God that is a foretaste of the beatific vision. He would expand this into 12 steps, building on the work of St. Benedict. The steps of humility are an ascent toward union with God. So I think it's fair to say that it is St. Bernard who really introduced the Church to contemplative prayer as distinct from meditation. But what is it that we are supposed to contemplate exactly? Well, to move beyond the meditation on created things to real contemplation, the contemplative is meant to contemplate the attributes of divinity. For, as St. Augustine had pointed out, God does not have omnipotence, God is omnipotence. God does not have omniscience, as if that was something distinct from God. God simply is omniscience and omnipresence and omnibenevolence. In other words, God doesn't simply have love or even show love. God is love. And all of these things are the very definition of what divinity is. God is the first cause and source of all existence, and the end and purpose toward which all existence is meant to be oriented. And in this way, one focuses on God as an end in himself, not as a means to an end, and prayer becomes pure adoration. Not so much faith-seeking understanding, as Anselm had said, but faith expressing itself in adoration of the mystery without needing to understand it. Another way to think of loving God for his own sake is loving God motivated purely by gratitude, not least for our forgiveness, but also simply for our existence. We thank God for creating us in the first place. And so, St. Bernard defines love in part as a function of gratitude. The tricky part for us humans is to use our God-given free will to submit to God rather than go our own way. Because, as Bernard says, true love is grateful, that is, content with having what it loves, and it does not look for something else. If it does, then it really loves what it pursues, not what it has. To love God, then, is not to look for something else, but to pursue only a deeper relationship with God. The goal of contemplative prayer is a spiritual or mystical union with God, what the mystics saw as a kind of spiritual marriage. And as I hinted earlier, we know that St. Paul said that matrimony of a husband and wife is a sign of the union of Christ with his church, who is his bride. But the mystics, following those earlier allegorical commentaries on the Song of Songs, would say that in addition to being a sign of the church as the bride of Christ, the matrimony of a husband and wife is also a symbol of the union of Christ with an individual soul. Now, not everyone who wrote an allegorical commentary on Song of Songs is automatically a mystic, but the mystic applies this concept to contemplative prayer, the goal of which is this mystical union with God that amounts to a foretaste of the beatific vision. Now, this foretaste of the beatific vision, as long as one is still alive, is only fleeting moments of spiritual ecstasy. And I think that a mystic would probably say that this is what St. Paul's third heaven was. But no matter how fleeting or even how elusive, contemplative prayer and mystical union facilitate sanctification, or what is called in the East theosis, or deification. St. Bernard was heavily influenced by St. Anselm and somewhat by Saints Boethius and Benedict. And in terms of his mysticism, he was influenced by Pseudo-Dionysius, St. John Climacus, and St. Maximus the Confessor. In turn, St. Bernard was a great influence on St. Francis of Assisi and on both Thomas Aquinas and Bonaventure, as well as on Thomas à Kempis's Imitation of Christ and Ignatius Loyola's Spiritual Exercises. He may even have written the prayer known as the Memorare, or if he didn't write it, whoever did write it got it from his sermons. St. Bernard died in the year 1153. He was canonized in 1174, only 21 years later, and at his canonization, Pope Alexander III implied that he was already a doctor, but he was officially made a doctor of the Church in 1830 by Pope Pius VIII. His feast day is August 20th. In our time and in our culture, the very concept of love has become something of a paradox. In one sense, it's been watered down, confused with baser forms of desire, or the distinctions between agape and eros have been blurred. But on the other hand, it's also been put up on a pedestal and made into an obsession, made into an idol. And I think, especially for men, if I can risk crossing the line from personal experience into generalization, for men who wish to be faithful believers, the question of how to properly love and love God is an important one. And St. Bernard is one of our doctors who helps us reorient our definition of love and who teaches us how to love God. So then, what would I recommend as the first document to read by St. Bernard of Clairvaux? It would definitely be his treatise On Loving God, which is included in the volume on him in the Classics of Western Spirituality series. And there are excerpts of some other things in that volume to keep you going. I'll provide a link in the description. And now I'll leave you with a short excerpt on that intersection of gratitude and love. Allow me to paraphrase for the sake of clarity in this audio format. St. Bernard says, "Simply because God created me, I owe him everything. So what could I ever give him to repay him, not only for making me, but also for remaking me? For it was easier for him to make me than to remake me. To make me, he only had to speak a word, to speak me into existence. But to remake me, he had to say a whole lot more. He had to become incarnate and do miracles and suffer hardship, and not only that, but suffer humiliation. As the psalmist wrote, "What then shall I give the Lord for all that he has given me?" In the first act, he gave me myself. In the second act, he gave me himself. And in doing that, he gave me back myself. He has given and given again, and I owe him all that I am twice over. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, Arbiter of Christendom, pray for us in these times of controversy. Next time, on the Way of the Fathers, Saint Hildegard of Bingen. Thanks for listening.
De quorum solemnitate gaudent angeli et collaudant filium Dei.
Way of the Fathers is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Catholic Culture audiobooks, bringing to life classic Catholic writings, Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.